Wanted, ambitious individual for leadership position. Be prepared for difficult application process and stressful work environment. Challenges, many. Rewards, numerous. Failure, possible. Your employer, the American people. The few chosen have been the presidents. By the late 19th century, the United States had left behind a political revolution and entered an industrial one. In the 20 years that followed the Civil War, America experienced 2 presidential assassinations and 5 mediocre presidencies. From Andrew Johnson's impeachment through Chester A. Arthur's laconic administration, the power of the executive office had clearly waned. By the 1880s, the President of the United States was hardly seen as the most powerful man in the land. Instead, that title was held by the likes of J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie, America's potent captains of industry. It was an era of extremes, with 1/8 of the population owning 7/8 of the wealth. For many citizens, it was an era of economic and political disenfranchisement. Scandals had rocked the White House and shaken public confidence. But the hotly contested presidential election of 1884 would become one of the dirtiest campaigns in American political history, as the morality of both candidates was called into question. The Democrats nominated New York Governor Grover Cleveland. He was known as Grover the Good because he devoted his life to cleaning up corrupt government. But he also had a skeleton in his closet, which Republicans were quick to expose.
The Republicans brought up the fact that Grover Cleveland had had an illegitimate child. And they even wrote a little poem about it. Ma, ma, where's my pa?
And to that, the Democrats replied,
Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha.
Stunning everyone, Cleveland came right out and confessed, taking full responsibility for the child. The public forgave him, even praising him for his honesty. Then the Democrats fought back, telling voters that the Republican opponent, James G. Blaine, had been a dishonest politician, guilty of corruption.
And their little poem was, Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine.
In the end, it was a close race, but voters decided to keep Blaine in Maine, and Grover Cleveland was off to the White House. Number 22, Grover Cleveland, Democrat, 1885 to 1889, 47 years old, from New York. Cleveland was an honest politician, but typical for his day, he wasn't a proactive one. Rather than implement his own programs, Cleveland saw the president's job as simply one that should stop bad things from happening. And he did this quite effectively by exercising his veto power.
Cleveland had the largest number of vetoes of any president until Franklin Roosevelt, and in his first term, something like 414 vetoes, about twice as many of all of his predecessors combined.
Cleveland truly didn't see the presidency as a platform for initiating positive change, a political philosophy that would be his downfall. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, ingrained with a strong work ethic, firm sense of duty, and a streak of self-reliance.
He answered his own phone in the White House. He answered his own doorbell in the White House. He wrote all of his own speeches, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, studied all of the measures and legislation himself until 2 in the morning, and then after 18 hours of work would sigh, lean back, and say to his secretary, well, let's knock off and call it half a day.
When he was elected, the 47-year-old Cleveland was a bachelor who appeared to have no romantic prospects in sight. In truth, he was secretly courting a 20-year-old college girl named Frances Folsom. As soon as Frances graduated from college, Cleveland proposed marriage, and on June 2nd, 1886, Grover Cleveland became the first and only president to get married in the White House. The wedding was celebrated across the nation, and overnight the American public fell in love with the beautiful new First Lady. While Francis monopolized the public's fascination, Cleveland returned to his role as the chief watchdog in government, vetoing bills that he saw as unwarranted drains on the American Treasury.
Well, in one of his veto messages, he said, while the people should support the government should not support the people.
But his outlook was gradually growing out of favor. Many Americans were now looking to the government for assistance.
This was a period where it was becoming more and more clear that the federal government was not keeping up with changes in American society at large.
Particularly unpopular was Cleveland's objection to pensions for Civil War veterans.
One of the questions was, how can you tell that Grover Cleveland stays up past midnight vetoing pension bills? And the answer is because he's often so much in the dark about them.
It was a policy that would cost Cleveland the veterans' vote when he ran for re-election in 1888. And it didn't help that Cleveland himself had not served in the war. The Republican political machine, funded by big business, had found an attractive challenger in lawyer Benjamin Harrison. Harrison was a Civil War veteran, sympathetic not only to his fellow comrades, but to the special interests of those who ran his campaign. He quickly became the money candidate. And the big money issue that dominated the campaign was the Republican-backed protective tariff levied on foreign goods.
For most of the 19th century, for all of their existence as a political party, the Republicans had been the party of protectionism. This was conceived as necessary for the emergence of American industry in a time when the United States was industrially a laggard in world affairs.
The tariff was the hottest political issue in the 1888 campaign, and the country was clearly divided. In an election comparable to the 2000 race, Democrat Cleveland actually won the popular vote. But Republican Harrison became president because he won in the Electoral College. Upon her departure from the White House, First Lady Frances Cleveland told the staff to take good care of the place. They'd be back. Number 23, Benjamin Harrison, Republican, 1889 to 1893, 55 years old, from Indiana. Benjamin Harrison was America's centennial president. Elected exactly 100 years after George Washington, the nation celebrated by having Harrison reenact Washington's inauguration in New York City.
He was a very good speechmaker, but he didn't have much more role than that. And most people thought it was a mighty big downturn to go from a George Washington to a Benjamin Harrison in a short 100 years.
Trying to fill the big shoes left by America's forefathers was a role Harrison was accustomed to.
One Benjamin Harrison signed the Declaration of Independence. His own grandfather had been president of the United States. They still remain the only grandfather-grandson to be president. He had a tough time coming out of the shadow of his grandfather, who was sort of legendary, William Henry Harrison.
While William Henry Harrison had enjoyed fame as a war hero, his place in presidential history is insignificant because he died just 1 month after he was inaugurated. His grandson would take the oath nearly half a century later. Almost immediately, Benjamin Harrison began to lose the support of those around him because of his indifferent demeanor.
Benjamin Harrison was known for having a glacial personality. He was very brusque, he could be very formal. He was described by people as the human icicle.
Among the people he alienated was almost every political boss within the Republican Party. They all felt that they were the ones who helped him get to the White House.
Harrison did do right by his fellow veterans, but he nearly bankrupted the nation's treasury in the process. His administration presided over America's first billion-dollar Congress.
They passed the first comprehensive pension legislation in the history of the United States for Civil War veterans. That turned into a boondoggle because when the law was passed in 1890, 14-year-old girls ran out to marry these 70-year-old men, knowing that one day they would get their pensions.
At the insistence of party leaders, Harrison signed into law the highest, most protective import tax in American history, the McKinley Tariff, named after the congressman and future president, William McKinley. As a result, foreign manufacturers ceased to export products to America, and several American corporations gained monopolies on the manufacture of many essential goods. With no foreign competition, consumer prices skyrocketed, and Harrison's popularity with the common man plummeted.
This was particularly unfortunate for the president seeking re-election at that time because, of course, what the Republicans had been saying for years is the protective tariff is aimed primarily at helping workers, that we're trying to protect American workers from the products coming in from abroad made by cheap labor.
Benjamin Harrison was considered a decent, honest fellow by his contemporaries. He tried to do right for his country, but his policies were a failure in the eyes of many. One of Harrison's harshest critics was Grover Cleveland, and he was about to make the most surprising political comeback in American history. Benjamin Harrison was the first to put electricity in the White House, but both he and his wife were too afraid to touch the switches. On November 8, 1892, Grover Cleveland became the first and only president in U.S. history to win 2 non-consecutive terms in office. He had campaigned on a platform to reduce the McKinley Tariff, and the people had responded overwhelmingly, electing him to a return engagement by a landslide. Number 24, Grover Cleveland, Democrat, 1893 to 1897, 55 years old, from New York. Cleveland's return to the presidency was triumphant. With his young wife Frances and their new daughter, baby Ruth, the Clevelands were more popular than ever. Unfortunately, an economic disaster was about to strike. A month after Cleveland regained the office, the panic of 1893 hit. The great industrial bubble of the 19th century had burst.
The 1890s saw the worst economic depression in American history until that point. Starting in 1893, tens of thousands of people were thrown out of work, and this at a time when there was essentially no social safety net.
In protest, an army of the unemployed marched on Washington, the first of its kind.
When they arrived in Washington, Cleveland had them arrested for trespassing on the grounds in the Capitol.
Grover Cleveland might well feel compassion for the poor and those in want, but he didn't think it was the national government's responsibility to provide jobs in a depression or help of any kind. He was not a cruel man or an uncompassionate man. I think any other president in the 1890s would have behaved the way he did.
Complicating matters was the debate over the nation's monetary system. Eastern industrialists insisted on gold, the supply of which they controlled. In opposition, farmers, Westerners, and a grassroots party known as the Populists supported bimetallism, a currency system which allowed silver and gold. The monetary debate was the central political issue of the 1890s, representative of a deeper war over opposing beliefs on public policy, finance, and the equitable distribution of wealth. Cleveland opposed bimetallism, declaring that the solidity of the gold standard would end the Depression. This made Cleveland look like a pawn of the industrialists, and suddenly his popularity among the masses faded.
I find him in many ways a fascinating figure and an admirable figure. I just wish he had only been elected to 1 term. I think the 2nd term was a great misfortune for him and for the country.
Unable to heal the nation's economic crisis and out of touch with the growing political movement for government reform, Cleveland was dropped from the Democratic ticket in the election of 1896. When Grover Cleveland exited the White House for the final time, he left a legacy as the last of the laid-back 19th century-style presidents. He had hoped to passively steer the ship of state into the future by maintaining the status quo. Instead, he found himself unable to deal with the dynamic changes that were pushing the nation very quickly into the 20th century. Leaving Cleveland behind were two vibrant presidential candidates, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who pleaded the case of the common man, and William McKinley, a Republican backed by big money. In 1896, big money won. Number 25, William McKinley, Republican, 1897 to 1901, 54 years old, from Ohio.
McKinley is very interesting, I think, to anybody today, especially, because there are some important parallels between the McKinley administration and the administration of George W. Bush. There certainly was a sense in McKinley's day that corporate America had taken control of political America, and many people feel that way today.
He's also somebody who's a bit puritanical, very religious, bringing a morality of approach into politics, but sees that America has to have a new role in the world.
In an era of big personalities, McKinley was short, modest, and had a face some described as a mask of calm. His tranquil demeanor caused many to underestimate him. In truth, McKinley was much more dynamic. He brought with him to the executive mansion a new corporate sensibility and efficiency.
One reason William McKinley was an interesting president is he really pioneered a modern management of the press. It was the McKinley administration that figured out how to give stories to the press, how to feed the press, how to keep the press informed, and they really did all the 20th century stuff on the eve of the 20th century.
Yet McKinley couldn't control the sensational stories now being published in the newspapers about Cubans suffering under the brutal regime of the Spanish Empire. Cuba was one of Spain's colonies, as were Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
Cubans had been fighting for their independence for a number of years. There'd been a long-running, long-sputtering rebellion, and the Spaniards, in trying to stop it out, they used means such as concentration camps.
McKinley was not opposed to going to war, but he was reluctant. He was the last president to have fought in the Civil War, and his first-hand experience of bloodshed taught him to believe it should be the option of last resort. Yet newspaper reports of human suffering in Cuba, coupled with events abroad, made war look inevitable to many Americans.
American attitudes that led up to the Spanish-American War, in certain respects, were parallel to American attitudes leading up to the war against Iraq in 2003. In that, there were humanitarian reasons for going to war against Spain, just as against Iraq. The Spanish colonial government of Cuba was abusing and oppressing the Cuban people. There was no question about that.
It was also a time when the great nations of the world were building empires, and there was a growing fear that if the United States didn't start taking colonies, it would risk being overpowered.
There was a group in the Republican Party especially that even before the opportunity arose to go to war against Spain had been looking for a way, looking for an excuse, if you want to call it that, for the United States to claim military bases overseas, naval bases overseas, territories overseas, to expand American military power in the Caribbean, in the Pacific.
Equally important was America's appetite for foreign resources.
Americans wanted to have economic relations with Cuba. They didn't want its crops to just be going only to Spain. They wanted American companies to develop them and profit from them. So it was a combination of idealism and concern and self-interest.
And so those people who looked at a map of the world, folks like Theodore Roosevelt in the Navy Department, who could be likened, for example, to Paul Wolfowitz, the #2 man in the Defense Department. These were folks who thought in very broad terms, and they had this notion that the United States could expand its power for the welfare of the United States and, frankly, for the welfare of the world.
Theodore Roosevelt was McKinley's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and his opposite, an obstreperous, controversial character who hungered for war with Spain.
He was probably the most influential person in America regarding American foreign policy. And if a single person pushed the United States into war against Spain, it was Theodore Roosevelt.
Although McKinley remained wary at the prospect of battle, he agreed to send a warship to Cuba to protect American interests there. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded, killing 267 servicemen. Although no one knew what had caused the explosion, the public outcry made it nearly impossible for McKinley to resist going to war with Spain. On the 25th of April, 1898, America declared war on Spain. Roosevelt resigned his executive position and organized a volunteer regiment known as the Rough Riders to fight in the war.
Most people thought Theodore Roosevelt was at least mildly unhinged to make this decision. But for personal, temperamental reasons, Roosevelt had to fight.
With an easy victory over Spain, America became an imperial power, taking possession of Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. That the USS Maine was probably sunk by an accidental engine room explosion and not by a Spanish mine was not known for many years. The war bolstered the economy, and the country was on an upswing as it entered the 20th century. McKinley's running mate was none other than Theodore Roosevelt, put there by some Republicans who wanted to neutralize his growing power. The ticket won, but very soon a tragedy would turn America upside down. William McKinley may have been a role model for author L. Frank Baum, who apparently fashioned the title character of his landmark novel after the president, The Wizard of Oz. In September 1901, just 6 months into his second term, William McKinley traveled to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, to take in the sights and give a speech. Among the crowd of well-wishers was Leon Czolgosz, an unemployed factory worker and self-described anarchist who was enraged at the disparity between the rich and the poor.
He just went through the receiving line, and he had a bandaged hand as if he'd hurt it, and there was a pistol in it, and he just came up to the president, and instead of shaking his hand, he killed him.
Americans were aghast at the third presidential assassination in 36 years, and they deeply mourned their fallen leader. Although he had been taken prematurely, William McKinley had already left a remarkable legacy. He had presided over an era of significant change in the nation, but an even greater transformation was about to begin. Number 26, Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, 1901 to 1909, age 42, from New York. The Republicans' worst nightmare had come to pass. Theodore Roosevelt was no longer just a heartbeat from the presidency. He was the president. TR, as he liked to be called, was a complicated man, a mass of contradictions, and he could not be bullied. He was a conservative, yet he fought for reform. He was a hunter who started the conservation movement, a hawk on war who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Perhaps the only thing that can be easily understood about him is that he was an original.
TR never identified himself as a Republican. In fact, I've read a letter recently that's been unpublished that his uncle wrote and said what they don't understand about Teddy is that he's a Democrat, that he was both. He never thought in terms of pure party politics. He thought about what was right for the American people. And that's a great lesson for presidents to learn. You don't represent your party as much as you represent the people. If you do what's right for the most people, what you think's right, you're going to be a great president.
Teddy Roosevelt was the most exciting man you ever met. And it didn't matter who you were. That's just what he was like. He was impossibly energetic. He was constantly doing things, constantly reading things, constantly thinking about things and talking about things.
What struck people about Theodore Roosevelt was just how much energy he had. He was a teetotaler, didn't drink alcohol, but drank a gallon of coffee a day. So he was wired all the time.
Roosevelt was one of these people who sucked the air out of every room that he was in. He exuded charisma in a way that required everybody to pay attention.
Theodore Roosevelt, without question, was the most electrifying politician of his generation.
Roosevelt was also a shrewd politician. He knew politics were driven by personality, and he used the sheer force of his personality to get what he wanted.
Every issue with Teddy Roosevelt is affected by his personality. I mean, maybe more than any president we have ever had, his personality infused his politics and either won him supporters or bitter enemies.
He believed in good and evil. He believed that a single individual could have a large impact on the course of affairs. He had this sense that there was room in national life, even in this modern industrial age, for the same kind of selfless heroism that he had read about in the hero stories of the past.
Roosevelt did not waste much time going after what he thought was America's greatest evil: too much power in the hands of corporate America.
When Roosevelt becomes president, it was a toss-up who the most powerful man in the country was. It might have been Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, or it might have been J.P. Morgan, the most powerful financier in the country.
Roosevelt came to believe that the great industrialists in the United States did, in fact, wield too much power, and he decided that this should be curbed.
5 months into office, Roosevelt took J.P. Morgan head-on. He sued the tycoon's Northern Securities Corporation to halt its monopolization of the Western railways. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a close decision, the government was successful. Morgan's monopoly was crushed. As a result, Roosevelt gained a reputation as a trust buster. But in truth, he was a trust regulator.
His underlying view was that large size in industry is something that comes with the territory of the Industrial Revolution. We can't turn back the clock on that. However, we have to remind these corporate barons that the people, not the trusts, not the capitalist system, but the people control affairs in this country.
The thing that TR feared was that if he couldn't get corporate America to let a little steam out of the pot, it would blow up.
Lingering societal ills were bubbling over. There were no sanitation systems, highways, or social welfare. In New York, poor people starved. Across America, 1 child out of 5 worked in a factory, mine, or sweatshop. Conditions for laborers were miserable, particularly coal miners. So it was not a surprise when the anthracite coal miners went on strike in 1902. Management and labor were hopelessly deadlocked, and winter was looming. Without coal, the entire Northeast would freeze. Fearing untold misery and riots, the president personally intervened.
Roosevelt took the view that the President of the United States was uniquely positioned to act on behalf of the American people. It's only the President who can see and who must see things in terms of the entire national interest. And when he saw what the coal strike threatened to do to America as a whole, he felt obliged to take action.
After threatening to nationalize the coal mines, Roosevelt brought the two sides together and forged a settlement that favored labor over management. The coal strike was over, and Roosevelt's first great domestic crisis was averted, much to the relief of the nation.
He never wanted to feel that one tycoon, one billionaire, could shut the whole railroad system down or could knock out the entire coal industry. It would cripple America. He never wanted to see anybody have the power that could hurt the country.
Roosevelt's resolution of the strike was a crucial turning point in labor relations, paving the way to better working conditions. It would be one triumph in many of social and economic reforms that Roosevelt called his square deal. What Roosevelt had in mind for foreign policy, however, would be much more radical. While president, Theodore Roosevelt officially renamed the executive mansion the White House and added the West Wing. Theodore Roosevelt had been the greatest political force behind the Spanish-American War. He saw America's emergence as a world power not only necessary for survival, but a duty. He felt Americans had a responsibility to civilize the rest of the world.
He made the country realize that we now, in a post-Spanish-American War era, had a global responsibility. We were no longer a country being born, that we were now a world leader, and that with that came a new kind of global responsibility.
Roosevelt, more than anybody, believed America needed a canal through the Central American Isthmus owned by Colombia.
The thought was this canal was going to be a way to protect both seas of America, that any moment if the East Coast was attacked, the West Coast fleet could quickly come to its aid.
Now, Roosevelt believed this canal, the Panama Canal, would be a very good thing for the United States, but he believed it would also be a very good thing for the world.
The Colombian government didn't exactly agree with Roosevelt, at least not at the price he was offering. So, once again, Roosevelt took unorthodox measures. He backed a local revolution and helped create the nation of Panama in exchange for the right to build a canal there.
He was criticized very heavily for his high-handed role in dealing with the government of an independent American republic, for basically giving them the back of his hand, and for fomenting revolution, but he never apologized.
He used to say, I didn't steal the Panama Canal, I built it.
It was the largest engineering project ever undertaken. And when it was completed, it became one of the wonders of the world.
When it opened, Roosevelt believed that that was his major contribution to world civilization, and he never changed his mind about that.
But America was not the only one infiltrating Latin America. Increasingly, European powers were moving into the region, ostensibly for the purpose of forcing debtor nations to repay their loans. Roosevelt found their presence a strategic threat. Without consulting Congress or asking permission from Latin America, Roosevelt invoked the Monroe Doctrine and stated that the U.S. was now in charge of the Western Hemisphere.
Roosevelt announced that henceforth the United States would consider that it held a police power, that was the term he used, to enforce good behavior on the countries of the Western Hemisphere. This was simply his way of saying, if somebody has to clean up the neighborhood, it's going to be the United States.
It was a bold position to take, and Roosevelt backed it up with what he called big stick diplomacy.
I mean, his famous quote is, speak softly and carry a big stick.
Meaning you don't have to yell at people abroad, but at every minute you have to be militarily prepared. The big stick is your arsenal. It is your Navy. And this was a way of intimidating other countries and realizing that we were going to fight for American rights. If you sacked a consulate somewhere or if you intercepted and impressed an American ship, there were going to be consequences.
In 1904, Roosevelt was elected by the largest popular margin in American history up to that time. Joyous, Roosevelt told the country he considered this to be his second term, and he promised not to run again. It was a public statement he would come to regret. As popular as Roosevelt was, progressive-minded Americans thought he could do more for social and economic reform. The influx of new immigrants, over 8 million in the first decade of the 20th century alone, had turned life for the working class from bad to intolerable. Intending to expose the horrific conditions experienced by immigrant workers inside a Chicago meat plant, author Upton Sinclair sent shockwaves across the nation with his book, The Jungle. It was an expose of the meatpacking industry.
The conditions there were terrible. They didn't have bathrooms, they didn't have toilets. There was nothing like a sink where you washed your hands. It was a mess. Rats running in and out of the place and dropping down into these big grinding machines, and lurid stories about it, you know, workers falling in there, or just all kinds of bad things.
Roosevelt responded immediately, realizing it was an opportunity for the federal government to act on behalf of the consumer. In 1906, he obtained passage of the Meat Inspection Act as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act. Also in 1906, Roosevelt created the Antiquities Act. This was the authorization he needed to halt the destruction of the American landscape.
There was a sense that as the frontier closed, the wildness of America maybe was disappearing. And Roosevelt noticed this on some of his Western trips.
They were going to destroy the Grand Canyon until TR intervened. And what Roosevelt said is, no, these places, these pristine wilderness spots, are the heirlooms of America. As surely as the priceless masterpieces in the Louvre, these are what we've got to save for our children.
By the end of his term, Roosevelt had preserved more than 230 million acres of land. But it's only one part of his legacy. He also created better labor conditions, business regulations, and strengthened America's position on the world stage.
I think Teddy Roosevelt was a good president, and the main reason I say that is foreign policy. He had a vision, he had plans, and he made them happen.
Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to realize what an important moral position the president had simply by being president. A president represents the American people. The president can articulate the views of the American people, but he can also influence those views and to mobilize the American people behind important reforms.
Theodore Roosevelt's legacy is with us every time you turn on a faucet and take a sip of water that's not contaminated. It's with you every time you cook a hamburger on a grill and know you're not going to die from it. It's with you every time you want to take a hike through the Sierra Nevada mountains or go for a swim in the Great Lakes.
Roosevelt agonized over leaving the presidency. There was so much more he wanted to do. But true to his word to the American people, he did not run for re-election in 1908. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to fly in an airplane, own an automobile, and dive in a submarine. After much soul-searching, Theodore Roosevelt thought it better to keep his word with the American public than to run for office again in 1908. Instead, Roosevelt decided to handpick his successor, someone he could rely on to carry out his agenda. With William Howard Taft, Roosevelt thought he had the perfect candidate. Number 27, William Howard Taft, Republican, 1909 to 1913, age 52, from Ohio. Originally brought into the civil service by President William McKinley, Taft had distinguished himself as the Governor General of the Philippines. Taft went on to serve under Roosevelt, and the two men became best friends.
He had been a kind of utility infielder in the McKinley and Roosevelt administrations. He was the kind of person that if you had a job that needed doing, you could stick him in it and he'd do a good one.
Happy to have been Roosevelt's right-hand man, Taft never had any real desire to be president.
Taft was very reluctant to run for president. He didn't really want to do this. He wasn't a natural politician, his problem was. He really, not only did he not want to be president, but he wasn't a politician in general. It was his wife who pushed him into it.
Taft's wife, Nellie, had always dreamt of living in the White House. Ironically, soon after Taft's inauguration, Nellie suffered a stroke and was never able to enjoy the First Lady lifestyle she had wanted so badly. A lawyer by trade, Taft's one ambition had always been to be a Supreme Court justice.
He said once that a good judge is our model in our minds of what God is like. Not that he, aspired to be divine or anything like that, but he thought that a good judge was the highest human type, and that's what he wanted to be.
As president, Taft took a narrow legal route in all matters, quite different from the precedent-setting Roosevelt. In truth, the two men were opposites in almost every way. Roosevelt was famous for his athleticism, while Taft was often ridiculed because of his weight.
Taft had a long experience as an overweight man. He was big all his life. And he had a great sense of humor about that and about everything. He would love to tell the joke about being on the streetcar. He said, I got up and I gave my seat to 3 ladies.
But once in the White House, Taft's jovial personality began to falter, largely because he hated the glare and scrutiny of the intense political spotlight on the presidency.
He became grumpy and depressed, and of course, he ate more and more and more. And he gained 100 pounds, up to 355 pounds. This was a symptom of his unhappiness.
In what must have been the ultimate humiliation, Taft once had to be pried out of the White House bathtub.
They finally put in a new bathtub in the White House that was reputed to be as big as a small swimming pool.
Taft's discomfort in the presidency was also apparent in his weak leadership.
He generally, as a rule, delegated responsibility, and he allowed most of his cabinet members to pretty much do as they pleased.
Taft fretted over making decisions and often procrastinated. He believed the president's job was merely to uphold the Constitution. Groundbreaking policies set by the freewheeling Roosevelt were slowly starting to reverse under Taft.
And TR was like a pot boiling over, watching Taft dismantle a lot of the programs and agendas that he had set. And he wanted revenge on Taft, and he got it.
Well, Taft may not have enjoyed being president, but he doesn't want to be bullied out of it by Teddy Roosevelt.
Taft himself probably would not have run for the presidency had he not been so angry by Roosevelt's increasing criticism of his administration.
The former best friends battled each other for the Republican nomination in 1912. It became so ugly that at one point, Taft broke down in tears.
It was particularly sad, the renomination process, because Roosevelt, being the combative fellow he was, began to speak more and more ill of Taft, and he publicly called him a fathead, a dimwit, a puzzle wit, and a man with brains of about 3 guinea pig power, which was devastating to Taft.
In turn, it was devastating to Roosevelt when the Republicans chose Taft as their candidate because they preferred his conservative politics. Even more shocking was Roosevelt's reaction. He joined the progressive Bull Moose Party. The result was a division in the Republican vote, opening the path for a clear victory for the Democratic challenger, Woodrow Wilson. Taft came in a distant third behind Roosevelt.
So he had gone into the presidency with a huge sweep and left in a most embarrassing way with only 8 electoral votes. But he didn't care. He was just so glad, as he said, to step down and out. He couldn't care at all.
After leaving office, Taft lost weight and finally achieved his lifelong ambition of being named Chief Justice of the United States, a position he excelled in as much as he enjoyed. Sadly, William Howard Taft's legacy has long been overshadowed by Theodore Roosevelt's, which is largely due to the great differences in their personalities. TR loved the presidency, and Taft hated it. But contrary to Roosevelt's accusations, Taft's administration did much to continue the many progressive measures initiated by Roosevelt. And in fact, he did more to regulate monopolies than TR. And it turned out that Taft also had remarkable foresight about the dangers of an emerging 20th century-style imperial presidency and its potential abuse of executive power and privilege.
This is Mother Nature out of control. Could these natural disasters have been prevented? How is the latest technology helping us predict the next disaster? And how can history teach us to prepare for next Nature's Fury Week? Begins tonight at 8 on the History Channel.